Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop, created for people with diabetes by people who have diabetes. By Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
This week, aerospace engineer April Blackwell works at NASA's Mission Control. She always wanted to be an astronaut, but she was diagnosed with type 1 at age 11, and that changed everything. But since that day, she's found ways to break down barriers and pursue her love of space.
I just always say never give up and be a rule questioner, because there are a lot of rules that are based on old data and old diabetes technology and management techniques. And so it's worth asking the question.
April shares where asking those questions got her. And we talk about everything from family, she has 2 young children, to what it's like to work as a part of history in the space program. In Tell Me Something Good, a milestone for a tween with type 1, and her whole family gets in on the celebration. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to our first full show of 2020. Happy New Year, everybody. Hope your year is off to a great start. If you're new to Diabetes Connections, welcome. I'm your host, Stacey Simms. We aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection. My son was diagnosed 13 years ago, just before he turned 2. He's now a freshman in high school. He's 15 years old. My husband has type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting and local radio and television news, and that is how you get the podcast. As you have heard, if you are a longtime listener, some new things this year. We have some new sponsors. I dropped a minisode, a short episode last week. We're going to be doing those every week, so you get the full episode, which is something like this, where it's an interview and we have some segments, and then you'll have that minisode. I'm planning for every week right now. We'll see how it goes, which is a much shorter episode, just me on one topic. And please follow along on social media, because we're doing more new stuff this year. The Tell Me Something Good segment, which has become really popular in the show. We're putting that out on social media every week. Make sure you're following on Instagram. I am Stacey Simms. On Instagram, there's only the one account. On Facebook, it's easiest to just go and join Diabetes Connections, the group. Although I do post everything on our page, but you know how Facebook is. Sometimes they're just obnoxious and don't show you everything you want to see. Something else I'm trying in the new year is transcription. I am putting in the show transcription of every episode on the episode homepage. You can go to diabetes-connections.com and you scroll down. Make sure you look at the current episode, click on that, and in the show notes will be the transcription of the interview and hopefully the whole episode as well. Something new we're trying. We'll see how people like it. We'll see how you respond. If it's popular and people use it, we'll keep doing it. I have had a lot of requests for the transcripts over the 4.5 years of the show. And as technology is better and better, it's been a lot easier to get that done. Maybe I'll do a behind the scenes minisode one of these days and tell you about all the changes that we've gone through and some of the technology as podcasting really grows, how things have changed. But I know you're here to talk about April and NASA and how she got involved in the space program. It's such a great story. We'll get to April Blackwell in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneDrop. OneDrop is diabetes management for the 21st century. OneDrop was designed by people with diabetes for people with diabetes. OneDrop's glucose meter looks nothing like a medical device. It is sleek, compact, and seamlessly integrates with the award-winning OneDrop mobile app. Sync all your other health apps to OneDrop to keep track of the big picture and easily see health trends. And with a OneDrop subscription, you get unlimited test strips and lancets delivered right to your door. Every OneDrop plan also includes access to your own certified diabetes coach. If you have questions, you don't feel like waiting for your next doctor visit, your personal coach is always there to help. I am so excited to have OneDrop on board. Their program is amazing. Check them out. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneDrop logo to learn more. My guest this week is not someone who takes the answer no and accepts it and goes away quietly. April Blackwell grew up dreaming of the space program. As you'll hear, she watched out for NASA news like most of us watched Saturday morning cartoons when we were kids. But a diagnosis of T1D in 6th grade grounded her astronaut dreams. How did she decide to carry on anyway? What did she have to do to get where she is at Mission Control? Well, her blog name and her Skype handle are Nerdy April. And you'll hear me ask about that. But I got to tell you, when you talk to someone on Skype, which is how I do a lot of these interviews, the avatar, the logo, whatever you want to call it, of their name or their face is on the screen. So the whole time I was talking to her, it said Nerdy April on the screen, which really just made me smile. And I did have to ask her about it. Her story, though, it's a story of grit, of asking questions and refusing to give up. Here's my conversation with Mission Control's April Blackwell. April, thanks for joining me. I'm sure you're really busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, and I'm excited to be talking to you. I have lots and lots of questions, but I have to start with your name online and on Skype as we're talking. Nerdy April. Did you reclaim that nerdy title?
Oh, I'm a proud nerd. I think all nerds who are truly nerds are proud of it. So it actually started though because my blog title started as Nerdy April's Space Adventures. And if you take that as an acronym, like, everything NASA related, it spells out NASA. So it kind of was a little bit of a play on words and acronyms there, but it kind of turned into just Nerdy April, and that's how I've been rolling lately.
Okay, so I want to ask you at the blog, I want to ask you about working at NASA, but let's start at the beginning. You knew that you wanted to be involved in science and in space from a very early age, right?
Yeah, I was only about 5 or 6 years old. I was in a kindergarten, and my dad actually, he is an aircraft mechanic, so there's a little connection there, but he also is just a deep lover of the space program, and he grew up in the Apollo days, so sort of that romanticized moon landings and everything, and he was just enamored by it, and his love for the space program just really captured me. So that's kind of where that all was inspired from.
What were you doing, though, at age 5? I mean, were you and your dad looking at stars? Were you watching launches?
We weren't watching launches. I grew up in Arizona, so it's pretty far away from Florida and where most of the launches happen.
Well, I was thinking about on TV, because that's how I grew up.
Yeah, I definitely watched some on TV. We did have a very rudimentary telescope, so we would go out and mostly look at the moon since that was a big target we could watch. It didn't have a tracker or anything on it, so it was all manual and required some fine-tuning by Dad before I could look through it. We built model rockets together and launched those. Later on, I went to sort of local science camp during the summer and started getting excited about computers and everything that had to do with science. So robots and engineering type problem solving. And so it just stayed with me my whole life.
So when you were diagnosed, not too many years later, you were 11, what happened? Were you hoping to actually be an astronaut at that time?
Yeah, so I think that was always the pointy end of the spear for me, was to be an astronaut. That's when you watch TV and everything, those are the people that you see. So that was always kind of my final goal. When I was diagnosed at 11, it took a little bit of time for me to realize that astronaut was going to be more difficult now that I had type 1 diabetes. And some of that sort of came into focus later in my life. But at 11, it was kind of just heartbreaking. I was watching launches and getting excited about space, but then knowing that that probably would never be a reality for me.
So at age 11, I guess you have many choices, but you can say to yourself, well, that's that. I've got to find something else and be devastated. Or, too bad, I'm going to move forward and do this some way, somehow. Did that decision happen for you immediately? Or did it take some time for you to continue to love science the way you did?
It definitely took some time. And I guess I'll just touch on the fact that I think being diagnosed with diabetes at 11, well, in the first place, there's no great time to be diagnosed with diabetes.
No doubt.
But I think being diagnosed at 11, it sort of puts you on this really fast trajectory towards adulthood because you want to maintain your independence as much as you can. My parents implemented it such that I had to be able to give myself shots and test my own blood sugar before I could spend the night at a friend's house, for instance. And so that was a big motivator for me. And I think, maybe I always had a little bit of an inclination towards being a little older than what my physical age was. You can ask my mom. I used to wake up early on Saturday mornings to watch the news, not cartoons, just in the hopes that I might see, some information about NASA. But I think, sort of that catalyst of putting me on a trajectory towards adulthood helped steer my ideas about what I wanted to be in the future. And while I knew I could never be, or probably could never be, an astronaut, space was just so exciting to me. And talking about rockets, talking about, low Earth orbit and traveling 17,500 miles an hour, 5 miles per second, thinking about these huge engines that need to take astronauts and supplies up to space, I just couldn't get it out of my blood, out of my brain. And so I decided that even if I couldn't be an astronaut, I would love to work in the space program in some capacity. And that sort of led me to looking at an aerospace engineering degree.
All right, let's go back for a second about your parents and the transition at age 11. What was your diagnosis story like? Were you very sick for very long? I mean, I know sometimes we talk about it like, and then you didn't have diabetes, and then you did, and then life went on. But can you kind of fill us in on how you found out?
Yeah. So it was, I guess, nothing extremely remarkable about it, but maybe that's why I should tell it, is because, it's just sort of the normal warning signs that everyone comes up against. Yeah. And so it was kind of in the Christmas time frame, December time frame. I had just got a cold. And then, my grandparents were in town for the holidays, and we usually would stay up late playing cards and, eating Christmas candy. And I just physically couldn't. I was extremely fatigued. And then when I started getting up multiple times during the night to go to the bathroom, my mom, bless her heart, thought that I was probably suffering from a urinary tract infection. And her old wives' tales, of course, told her that we needed to treat this with cranberry juice.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we hit up the cranberry juice pretty hard for a little while, and it just wasn't getting better. And so we started going to the pediatrician's office, and it took almost a week of daily pediatrician visits. I joked that I could just pee on command because every time I would show up there, they would tell me to, get a urine sample. So it sort of became this joke. And then I was finally diagnosed on December 30th. And they told us that we needed to head over to the children's hospital right away, straight from the pediatrician's office. We had no idea what diabetes was about at all. I absolutely had zero idea. I don't think my parents really understood it at all. They were just scared. And so we went over to the children's hospital, but unfortunately it was sort of a skeleton crew because it was the holidays and New Year's and stuff. So they told us to just go home. And it turned out that my old pediatrician, he actually lived next door to us. And so he came over for a couple days to help give me some insulin shots and test my blood sugar while we still had no idea what, was to come. More shots every single day and blood sugar tests every single day. So it was definitely a steep learning curve, as I think most diagnosis stories are.
Yeah. It can just take so much time to get the diagnosis. I get so frustrated by that, but, at least they got it before it was even more devastating. Fast forward a few more years, you have kept your interest in space, as you said. What did you wind up studying in college? Or did you go, where did your path lead you to continue after high school? Right back to April answering that question in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Real Good Foods. Have you tried them yet? High protein, low carb, grain-free, gluten-free. They have so many delicious products, from breakfast sandwiches to pizza. The stuffed chicken is delicious. The little poppers that they make are just excellent. It's really nice to have something convenient when you're not in the mood to cook, or if you're a 15-year-old boy, you're starving and you need something to get you between the half an hour before dinner. So Benny will just get one of his little personal pizzas and heat it up. We're really big fans of Real Good Foods. I'm thrilled to have them back on the podcast for the new year. And I'm excited to try some of the new products they have out right now. We will be bringing you some taste tests as we go forward. But find out more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Real Good Foods logo. Now back to April. And I'm asking her about what happened after high school. How did she get to where she is now?
I was very fortunate to get a full ride scholarship in state in Arizona because of my grades. So I went to Arizona State University and studied aerospace engineering. And then once I got out, I kind of hit a little bit of a roadblock because there was a period of time in the aerospace industry that the space shuttle was looking at being retired. And so the future of NASA was a little bit unclear as to what was going to happen. So a lot of companies and related industries sort of put a hold on hiring right around that time, which was unfortunate, but it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because I ended up getting a job working with the Army, of all things, in Huntsville, Alabama. So I moved across the country to work in a triple wide trailer, we like to call it, in Huntsville, Alabama, which just sounds so glamorous.
Yeah. The movie stars all end up there.
Right.
No, that's great, though.
But it turned out to be a really great experience. So
did I also see somewhere where you were testing helicopters?
Yeah, so that's what I was doing for the Army. And it was really awesome. It wasn't quite space, but it was a really great way to get my feet wet on just what it means to be an engineer and what kind of engineering I personally like, because there's so many different avenues you can go with that degree. So yeah, in Huntsville, I got to fly on experimental helicopters and boss test pilots around, which was really fun. The group I was in actually was really tight-knit, and I'd say even more so than my group at NASA now. And part of that, I think, is because, you had to fill out paperwork that said who in your group would go tell your spouse or your significant other that there had been an accident. And so we really counted on each other to watch out for each other. And all of them absolutely supported me with my diabetes. My flight suit had specific pockets with snacks and blood testers and stuff. And so we always kind of joked like, oh, if you need a snack, April always has one in her left lower leg pocket or whatever. But they were super awesome.
Let me just jump in and ask. So when I said you were flying helicopters, I was then going to ask you, how the heck did you get clearance to do that as a person with diabetes? But it was you were passenger.
Correct. Yeah. So I flew on them, not actually physically flying them. But it did still require an FAA medical clearance, which took about 6 months to get all of the paperwork in and get clearance to finally fly on the helicopters.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to ask you about. Can you talk a little bit about doing this? Because it sounds so exciting, and I know so many young people who want to serve in the military or want to fly. And yep, we just got, in the United States, FAA says now you can be a commercial pilot with Type 1, so progress there.
Right.
But what do you need to do to, as we're going to talk about your path going forward, to kind of accomplish what you've done? You've mentioned medical screenings, things like that. There's just is there a lot of paperwork and exams? That's how I see it.
Yes. So I will tell you it's a little bit of a black box. Even now with the FAA's new guidance that Type 1s can apply for these waivers for Class 2 and Class 1 medicals, it's not clear to me how many Type 1s they've actually accepted into those medical clearance buckets. That data is never published. And in fact, the process to get a medical for me, like I said, took about 6 months. And it was really me going to an FAA doctor who said, hey, I can't clear you because you have Type 1 diabetes. I can check you for all the other stuff, but that's going to require some special paperwork. So he sent in his recommendation. Of course, I had to get letters and A1C readings from my endocrinologist. Initially, the paperwork, I started with about a year's worth of data. I sent that in, and it took about 3 back and forths between me and basically a black box doctor in Washington, D.C. at the FAA to finally get the amount of paperwork they wanted. And to be honest, I just got frustrated with the process. And so I called my mom and dad back in Arizona and I said, hey, can you just run down to the children's hospital and literally make copies of every single piece of paperwork that they have since my diagnosis? Back then it was all paper, not, digital. So it was literally copies of these pieces of paper, probably a 3-inch thick stack of papers. And I literally sent that into the FAA and I said, this is all the data that I have from my diagnosis X number of years ago. And I have nothing else to give you, basically. Wow. And they finally said, okay, that's enough. And they granted me clearance for 1 year. But it was a frustrating process. And I haven't tried to get another one, since moving to Houston, because I do all of my medical clearance now through the NASA doctors, so I can talk with them directly. There's an actual face. But the FAA doctors are a little bit of an enigma, I guess.
So I guess the lesson there, if a parent is listening or if an adult with type 1 is listening, is be persistent.
Yes. Yes. If it's something that you really want, you're going to find a way to overcome it and do it. And I just always say never give up and be a rule questioner, because there are a lot of rules that are based on old data and old diabetes technology and management techniques. And so it's worth asking the question, because a lot of these doctors, especially, if you think military doctors and FAA doctors, they deal with really almost perfect human specimens, if you will.
Yeah.
And so they just don't have the knowledge of what is going on in the diabetes sphere these days.
What an interesting thought. Yeah. Why would they know? Because everybody is like G.I. Joe walks through.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really interesting thought. Okay, so you're in these experimental helicopters. You're following your career. You're in a triple wide in Huntsville. How do you get to mission control?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say, just before I leave the helicopters for a minute, there in Huntsville, I had this opportunity to sort of push a lot of barriers that type 1 diabetics came up against, because the military doesn't allow type 1s, that were previously diagnosed, at least right now. And so I got to go through the altitude chamber, the helicopter dunker trainer, which is basically 2 days of being drowned alive. Oh. And I went through the parachute course. And all of these required talking with doctors and just explaining the situation to them, because they literally don't deal with type 1 diabetic patients, because that's a disqualification right off the bat. And all of them were super receptive, super open to it. My military friends supported me going and talking to them and coming up with plans. So, we would come up with a plan like, we're going to leave your pump on till we get to this pressure, and then we're going to take it off and leave it outside of the altitude chamber, and that's going to be 15 minutes. So make sure your blood sugar is at least 130 at that time, or whatever it is, Yeah. But it was a really great way to sort of break down those barriers. And it even included a 2-week course at the Naval Test Pilot School in Pax River, Maryland. So that was a really kind of culmination of all these, sort of barriers that I had overcome, and a way to sort of solidify that I was on the right path.
That's fantastic. Wow. And that's great to have that support from the people around you. I love to hear that.
Yes. Yeah, they were really great.
You get dunked, which sounds so enjoyable. I mean, I know you and I, it sounds like we have very similar personalities and enjoy a lot of the same things. Bananas. But you tell me about what led you then to your position at NASA.
Yeah. So for my helicopter job, I was doing a lot of traveling. Around 2 weeks every month I was gone. And for a newly married person, it was just a little bit hard on the family. So I started looking for some other opportunities, and found these jobs pop up in mission control. And I had absolutely no inkling that I would even get called to interview for them. But it turned into this flight test experience, this experience that I had working on the helicopters. While it sounds completely different, actually was a lot of the same skill set that they look for in flight controllers. And so that sort of allowed that door to be open to get an interview at NASA. Of course, I ended up falling in love with it. I mean, it was a job working at the home of manned space flight, and now crewed space flight with women, joining in. And getting to work in such a historic building like Mission Control. And, I'm even going there tonight. I'm working this evening, the evening shift to fly the International Space Station. So it's just really a dream come true.
Okay. I have chills as you're talking about controlling the International Space Station. The setup, I just want to take a moment because I think we all do know what mission control and flight control, what it looks like and what you do. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but what we're talking about is what we see in all those movies, right? When they say, Houston, we have a problem. You're Houston. I mean, you're that big room, right? This is the big room with all the guys in the white short sleeve t-shirts and the glasses from the movies that we've seen all these years. That's mission control.
Exactly. A skinny tie and a pocket protector. We don't smoke anymore in Mission Control.
God, that's so funny in movies.
Yeah, but if you get in the elevator, it's in the same building. So that the room, for instance, if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, the room that movie was based on is actually just one floor up from our current International Space Station control room. And so when you get in the elevators, I always joke it's sort of this aroma of like 1960s cigarettes and coffee mixed together. But that's just the way Mission Control smells, and it's hard to describe.
That's so wild. All right, so when you're going to work tonight and controlling the International Space Station, tell us what that really means. I mean, do you mind breaking it down a little bit? What are you going to be doing? I mean, in terms we can understand.
Absolutely. It's not that hard. So basically, we sit at a big console that has several computers. We monitor a lot of telemetry data coming down from the space station all the time. It uses a satellite constellation to make sure that we can get our data even when they're on the other side of the world. So we look at that data, we make decisions based on that data. If we see any anomalies, we may send commands up to the vehicle. And then on certain days or nights, there may be a big event like a docking or undocking, maybe a spacewalk. And on those days, our job is even a little bit more critical because we'll be sending lots of commands and making sure that the space station is performing its absolute best to make sure we don't have any anomalies where maybe there's another vehicle really close by. So,
have you ever had an experience that was, I don't know if frightening is the right word, but, where someone or a mission was in jeopardy?
I've had a few kind of small anomalies happen. I haven't been on console for anything very major, but that doesn't mean that major things haven't happened. It's just, hasn't lined up with my console shifts. But it's interesting because even when stuff happens when you aren't on console, you sort of have this adrenaline because you know what that person sitting in the seat is feeling. The whole lead up to being a flight controller, it's not like you're hired and the next day you're on console. We call it almost a second master's degree. So you have about 2 years of training. About a little over a year of that is sort of bookwork. So you're learning a lot of information about the system we control, and you're taking oral examinations. And then the next piece of it is simulations. So we actually simulate, really bad days that are worse than any days we've actually seen real time. And this is all to prepare you for that prioritization skill of being a flight controller and being able to work through stressful situations. So we always joke that one small anomaly in the real room feels like 50 anomalies, in the simulation room. And that's just how we have to train ourselves to be able to cope with that stress.
What is the best part of it for you? Is it walking into that building? Is it knowing that, that elevator is there and you're part of all that history? Is it just, logging in for the day? I'm curious what gets you still very excited about this? Because obviously you are.
Yeah, so I'd say there's kind of two pieces of it. There's sort of a physical, almost just, like chemical response when you cross the threshold into mission control. You have to swipe your badge like 5 times, to get in the building and then get in the room and all this stuff. So when you cross that threshold, it really is like you're just leaving all your other problems and everything else that you've thought about that day outside, because you need to focus and you need to bring your best self, in here, because there are literally at least 6 humans on board that are counting on you to take care of them and take care of their spaceship. And then as you sit down, we have what we call big boards in the front. So they're like these big projection screens. And we're always getting video down from the space station, usually in about 6 channels. And we call it the windowless room with the best view because the view is just incredible. I mean, we now have these HD cameras on board. And as you're flying, my favorite place to fly over is sort of the Mediterranean Sea, and just the colors juxtaposed there with like the desert sand in Africa it's just incredible. And without actually being an astronaut, I feel like it's close to being the next best thing. And then the second part is sort of what you were talking about, the history. In that very building, just 1 floor up, is where the controllers sat when we landed on the moon. And they worked through problems real time to tell the astronauts what to do. And these were people that had computers with much less computing power than our iPhones today. And they were very young. If you look at any of the documentaries and everything, these were like 20-something kids fresh out of college. You know, space, there wasn't as much history then, so it's hard to, you know, lead your whole life thinking you're going to be working in space. It's like something you just thrust upon you, basically. And they were able to overcome all of that and be able to land man on the moon. It still blows my mind today, even when I walk in that building.
That's amazing. So does type 1 diabetes on your job? Do you mind telling us a little bit about your routine? Because there's some very long shifts, lots of pressure. You know, you can't exactly take a lot of breaks, I would assume. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage it?
Yeah. So I mentioned before that we're constantly monitoring telemetry from the space station. And as type 1 diabetics, we're kind of used to that already, actually. We constantly monitor telemetry coming from our own bodies. I use a CGM, so I set that in a prominent place, and it has just become part of my scan pattern. I scan all of the data that I'm looking at, looking for anomalies, and then I also glance over at my CGM and just make sure that I'm trending the way I want to be trending. And generally on console, I'll keep my blood sugar a little bit higher, so I try to avoid going below about 120 or so, just because I know if at any moment something could hit, basically. And so, you know, I don't want to have that rush of adrenaline drop me really low. So yeah. I try to keep it a little bit higher. I always have snacks in the control room. We're allowed to eat. As you mentioned, they are long shifts, so you usually have a meal that you eat while you're there. And then all of the flight directors also know that I have type 1. That's not a requirement or anything, but I think as a member of their team, it's important that they know that's something that I'm also monitoring. And so it may require that I, you know, step out for a quick 2 minutes to go grab a snack or do a blood check or change a site. Even I've had to do that at work. And so I think just being really candid and open to answering any questions that they have is really important in sort of these high stress jobs like this.
And a while back, I interviewed Ernie Prado, who also works at NASA and also lives with type 1. And I know you know each other. So this is kind of a mom question. So I'm sorry for asking it. But, like, do you guys see each other at work? Do you check in with each other? I mean, I know not everybody with type 1 diabetes has to be friends, but the mom in me is kind of hoping that you support each other.
Yeah. So it's funny that you mentioned Ernie, because we sort of have this unofficial Johnson Space Center type 1 diabetes club. And Ernie actually sits in a completely different building off-site. He sits over at the airport now. So I don't see him daily, but we have sort of instant messaging capability. And so we'll frequently talk on there. And we have another friend who actually works in the search and rescue area. So he's doing a lot of cool things with the military in order to get our astronauts safely home after they land. And so it's really fun. We all meet and, you know, you'd think we would like talk about space and stuff because that's what we do, but we always end up just talking about our diabetes and what devices we're using, which ones are, you know, giving us trouble, which ones we're low on supplies for, if anyone's tried to, like, you know, come up with engineer a way to make something work better or whatever. So it's really fun to sort of have that outlet, and especially at work with kind of like-minded people.
I'm glad I asked.
Yeah.
What do you think will be next for you? Do you have other goals within what you're doing now? I mean, what you're doing now is so exciting, and I would assume you would want to do this forever. But are there other things that you would like to accomplish that you're working on?
Oh, that's a loaded question. There's so many things. Right now, I think my focus is just to, be the best engineer I can at work. And then I also have 2 little kids. So
that's right. Yes, okay, we'll talk about that. Yeah.
A 3.5 and a 1.5-year-old. So they are taking a lot of my energy right now. And I think that's totally fine. That's the season I'm in. And so I want to be able to enjoy that. And so I think as far as my career goes and everything, I definitely still have that astronaut dream out there. And I think there are opening up some new ways to be able to make that happen. If not for me, then definitely the next generation of diabetics, or maybe, if we come up with a cure, then the non-diabetics. But I'm really excited to see where that goes. And then I think also just kind of spreading this message that even if you perceive that there's something that could hold you back as a type 1 diabetic, make sure that you are asking questions, because it may not always be a hard no, and you sort of need to figure out what it is that is really keeping you from doing those things.
I don't want to get too personal, but I know a lot of listeners will be interested. When you have type 1, there are a lot of concerns about having children. I mean, less so today, but you have to do so much work, it seems to me. Was it, you seem like such a disciplined person anyway. And again, I don't want to pry, but healthy pregnancies, you did okay. You said you had a CGM. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I actually don't get this question very often, I think because everyone's so focused on the NASA part and space part. But I'm really happy to share because I think it is important. It's not something that a lot of women talk about. So yes, I had 2 kids, 3.5 and a 1.5-year-old now. The first was a girl, and everything went really, really well. I was induced, and that was sort of just my OB was being a little cautious with having diabetes and making sure I didn't go too long. And so I was induced, which turned into like a 40+ hour labor, which was unfortunate. But everything turned out just fine. And she has a lot of attitude now. So something worked there.
That's funny.
My son, so he's just about 18 months now, a little bit different flavor of pregnancy, as weird as that sounds. He had a lot of fluid around him while I was pregnant. So I gained a lot more weight, and I was just generally uncomfortable because I felt like my stomach was literally just going to burst open. It was so stretched out. And he ended up being a C-section baby, and he was over 9 pounds. And that was, again, early induced at about 38 weeks. So 2 completely different pregnancies. I had good control through both, and, all of the non-stress tests and all of that were going well. And it just turned into a little bit of a different labor situation with my son. So, but I have 2 awesome, healthy kids now, and they do take a lot of my energy. And it's interesting because, my daughter being 3.5, she understands I have these sort of extra devices hooked to me. And so she knows the word diabetes. She knows the word pump. She knows that sometimes I eat her applesauce pouch when I'm low and we're at the playground. Because that has happened before.
Sure.
And my son is still, he isn't quite to the point of communicating those feelings yet. So he'll touch my site and I'll tell him no, but it's just interesting seeing how they react to it. And I think in a way it will hopefully make them more empathetic to friends or people in the future that they come across, that this is just a normal part of life. And, everyone has something they're dealing with, I think. Type 1 diabetes happens to be mine, but everyone has something. And so keeping an open mind and not judging people based on devices or things that they see right off the bat, I think is really important.
Do you mind if I ask what devices you use, what pump and CGM?
Sure. I use the Tandem X2 pump and the G6, Dexcom G6 CGM. So I get that data right on the pump, which is really nice. I like both of them, so I'm a big fan. Before
I let you go, this is kind of a tough question for you to answer, but your mom and dad, you were 11 when you were diagnosed. You shared this love of space and science with your father. You have an incredible career. You have 2 children. They must have been worried during the pregnancy. Have you had a conversation with them about, wow, did you ever think after that diagnosis where I would be today?
Oh man, we've had a lot of conversations about this. It's very cyclical, I think, for us. When I was growing up, I would definitely have months where I was not literally diabetes high, but just high on life and really excited and full of energy. And then I definitely had points where I was really low and upset that I had diabetes. The one person that I knew that really wanted to be an astronaut and literally couldn't because of this disease. Somehow I was chosen to have this disease, of course. So I went through all those emotions and those feelings, and my parents were always there. They always supported my dream, and they really stressed to me the importance of working hard. And I will tell you, engineering is hard work, and it is hard to get through engineering school, even if you're really passionate about it. And so that support was priceless. I know my mom, she's an emotional person, and I think she was sometimes afraid that I wouldn't be able to sort of realize some of these dreams. And it's so great now, I'm in my early 30s and I have my dream job, and I send her pictures, from mission control probably every week just because I think it's really cool. And, seeing her and being able to just show her that, hey, like, we made it together. It's not just me. I mean, they did so much to help me. And my poor mom, she's not the most into space, but she dragged herself to those space museums that me and my dad wanted to go to.
Oh man, that's funny.
Sometimes she would be doing her crocheting over in the corner. So bless her heart, she was such a trooper through all of that. But I think it's really important now for her to see, these moments in my life. And now she gets to share those with other people that she meets that, maybe they've just had a diagnosis like this, or they know someone going through an issue that's, putting up some barriers. And she can say hey, look, we got through it. It's totally doable. I think that's the key. It's doable. And it's going to be tough, but if you want something, you need to just go for it and it'll absolutely work out. So we've just sort of on and off had those conversations. Let's see, I've had diabetes for 20 years now. So the last 20 years, I would say there's been conversations like that throughout the whole time.
Wow. Well, that's great. I'm so glad that you've had this conversation with your parents, as a mom of a son who is figuring out what he wants to do, and we don't want diabetes to hold him back. I don't mind saying I find your story incredibly inspirational. So April, thank you so much for joining me. And, I'll be following you on Instagram and elsewhere and looking for those pictures of mission control and everything. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Anytime.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
So much more about April at diabetes-connections.com. And I'm going to talk about her. I had a really emotional reaction to something. I'll share that in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And when you have a toddler diagnosed with type 1, like we did, you hear rumblings for a long time about the teen years. But when it hit us at full force a little early, I was so glad we had Dexcom. Benny's insulin needs started going way up around age 11. And frankly, they continued to go up until I think they started evening out about age 14, really just late last year. And, those hormone swings, everything we had to do, all the adjustments we've made, I cannot imagine managing diabetes during this crazy time without the Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system. We can react more quickly to highs and lows, see trends, adjust insulin doses with advice from our endo. I know using the Dexcom G6 has really helped improve Benny's A1C and overall health. If your glucose alerts and readings from the G6 do not match symptoms or expectations, use a blood glucose meter to make diabetes treatment decisions. To learn more, just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Before I move on from April Blackwell and her terrific story, I just want to share one more thing. So when I talk to all the guests, I always grab pictures of them, right? You see that on social media when we put the episodes out or at the episode homepage. There's usually a picture of a product or the person or, the crux of what we're talking about. And often they email me photos, but sometimes I scroll through just to kind of see which one I'd want. And I can say, hey, can I grab that one picture or whatever? So I was doing that with April and I came across, and I'll see if I can get her permission to share this in the Facebook group. She has a picture of herself dressed as an astronaut. And that picture is from, she was diagnosed at the end of December. So it's Halloween. I mean, it's just really a couple of weeks before she was diagnosed. And seeing her as a little girl, knowing what she wanted to do and knowing where she is now. And I guess I could have been sad about it because I got very emotional. And I guess the reaction could have been, oh, it's too bad that she didn't get to be that astronaut. But my reaction was this, I really got emotional. It's kind of embarrassing. Was this swell of admiration. I'm not sure I'd be that strong, whether I was, 11 years old or an adult, to be able to turn that situation into what she has been able to do with it. And as she mentioned with Ernie Prado, who also works at NASA. And you don't have to be an aerospace engineer to just kind of overcome what type 1 throws at you. And I think that's what happened when I saw that photo. I just thought, gosh, yeah. All of you just have to be strong. Even if you don't feel strong, you kind of have to be. And yes, parents too, but it's a different kind of strong for us, right? That's a different story altogether. So I'll see if April will let me post the photo. And I wonder if you'll have the same reaction that I did. But boy, what a great story. And I can't wait to follow along with her. It's Nerdy April. I'll link it up in the show notes on her Instagram account. All right, time for Tell Me Something Good, brought to you by our friends at Real Good Foods. And I know it's a podcast and I shouldn't be saying things like you got to see the picture, but you got to see the picture. And I will post it in the Facebook group. I will be posting it later this week on Instagram as we start posting the Tell Me Something Good stuff. But Amanda Lovely posted a photo of her kids celebrating what they called their last Lantis party. And she says the reason they were having a party, Annika, who is her daughter with type 1, is 10. It burns, right? Lantus burns a lot of people. If you're not familiar, this is a commonly used long-acting insulin. And Amanda said that Annika isn't a fan. This was a big moment. The picture shows, as they're having their last Lantus party, Annika with 2 of her siblings in party hats. So it's Nina and Kai, and they are hugging her, and everybody looks like they're having it looks like a birthday party. It's really cute. And apparently Malin, who is 5, but not in the photo, was also wearing a party hat. And the dog was as well, but not pictured. Amanda, you got to send us a picture of the dog. But they were really excited and supporting their sister, which is why this is the Tell Me Something Good. Not so much about the pump start, although I'm sure she appreciated that, and that's fun too. But it's always just so nice to see a family kind of get behind each other, right? You got to have that kind of support. And I will say that if Lantus burns you or your child, know that there are long-acting alternatives, not just switching to an insulin pump. And by the way, Amanda, make sure you save some of that long-acting just in case you have pump issues, right? You never want to have no long-acting on hand just in case. Talk to your endo. But if you're having an issue with Lantus, ask about switching. There are other long-actings out there that don't burn as much and that work differently, but that's definitely an endo-level decision. Do you have a Tell Me Something Good story? It can be anything from a diversary, a milestone, a last Lantus party. We have lots of fun stuff to share, and I love telling your good stories. You can always email me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, or post in the Facebook group, message me, send a carrier pigeon, whatever works for you. We will be sharing these pretty far and wide this year, and I'd love to hear your story. With the time-shifting nature of podcasting, as I've mentioned before, sometimes I'm recording before things are happening that I want to talk about, and then the show airs afterwards. And all of that to say, a lot of you have been following along with Benny, who has been on crutches for 6 weeks. And as I am taping this, he is hopefully getting the word in the next couple of days that he can be off crutches and maybe start some physical therapy. So next week, I hope to tell you a little bit more about that. And we're also going to the endo, which is a really good time for me to interview Benny because we're alone in the car and we're in the same space for once because that kid is so busy. I don't even see him half the time. But I'm going to try to talk to him about Control IQ and things that have gone on since we've last talked. We've made some other changes. And, he's just a different kid than he was even a year ago, which is kind of breaking my heart and kind of fantastic. But boy, it's been a big year for him. I don't know about you, but when my kids went from middle school to high school, it wasn't just a different school. It was like a different life. High school's very different. The schedule is different. The work is different. And I remember with my daughter, who is now a freshman in college, and as you're listening, is going back to school next week to do her second semester there. It just flies by. It goes by so quickly. So I'm trying to hang on for dear life. And hopefully Benny will talk to me, talk to you, and we'll get him on the show as well. Tons of events coming up. I'm not even going to run down the list. I will ask you, though, to go to the community page at diabetes-connections.com. You can see where we've been, where we're going. I've got a kind of a de facto book tour because I am the world's worst diabetes mom, which is taking me on the road right now, about 2 events a month. You can see them on the community page and see if I'm coming to your town. And if not, and you'd like me to come speak or tape a podcast or whatever, just let me know. All right, later this week, we have our second minisode. This one's going to be all about sleepovers. What worked for us? I had some questions about that, and I'm answering them. So we're going to be talking about sleepovers. That episode will air on Thursday, January 9th. And then our next regular interview episode will be next Tuesday. It's going to take me a little time to fall into the rhythm of this, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Let me know what you think. As always, the show is here for you. Thanks, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Simms, and I'll see you back here on Thursday.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.